October 14th, 1962. A crisp autumn morning. While most of the world was just waking up, a single American U-2 spy plane soared high above Cuba. What its cameras captured that day would push humanity to the very edge of extinction. This is the story of the day our world almost ended. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union, the world's two nuclear superpowers, stood eyeball to eyeball, each daring the other to blink. Their stakes. Not just victory or defeat, but the survival of civilization itself. The official story is well known. Soviet missiles in Cuba, a US naval blockade, and a tense standoff that ended peacefully. But the real story, the one hidden in declassified documents and whispered by those who were there, is far more terrifying. It all started with Operation Anadir, the Soviet code name for their secret deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba. Why? Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted to level the playing field. The US had nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. Placing missiles in Cuba was his bold and incredibly risky countermove. The plan was executed in absolute secrecy. Soviet soldiers were told they were heading to a cold climate, even issued skis and fur-lined parkas, all to mislead Western intelligence. They sailed on civilian ships, with the missiles hidden below decks, forbidden from even sunbathing to avoid suspicion. When that U-2 spy plane returned with photos of missile launch sites under construction, the White House erupted into a state of controlled panic. President John F. Kennedy assembled a team of his brightest advisors, known as the Executive Committee, The options on the table were terrifying. A full-scale invasion of Cuba, a surgical airstrike to take out the missiles. Both options risked a massive Soviet retaliation, potentially triggering a full-blown nuclear war. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, argued fiercely against a surprise attack, comparing it to Pearl Harbor. He warned it would stain America's moral standing forever. Instead, JFK chose a middle path, one that sounded less aggressive but was just as dangerous. A quarantine of Cuba. He deliberately avoided the word blockade, which is an act of war under international law. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech that sent a chill down the spine of every person watching. He revealed the existence of the missiles and announced the naval quarantine line around Cuba. Any ship attempting to cross it would be stopped, and if necessary, fired upon. The world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying more missiles and military equipment were steaming towards the quarantine line. US Navy warships were in position to intercept them. This was the moment of truth. In the Atlantic, a Soviet submarine, the B-59, was being harassed by US destroyers, dropping practice depth charges, trying to force it to surface. The submarine's crew hadn't had contact with Moscow for days. The air inside was foul, temperatures soared, and the captain Valentin Savitsky believed war had already broken out. He ordered the preparation of the submarine's secret weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Here's one of the most terrifying, little-known facts of the crisis. To launch this weapon of mass destruction, 3 senior officers on board had to agree. The captain and the political officer both said yes. The launch was imminent, but one man, Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla's chief of staff, said no. Arkhipov calmed the captain down, arguing that the American signals were not an attack. He single-handedly prevented a nuclear launch that would have instantly vaporized a US aircraft carrier and triggered an unstoppable chain reaction of nuclear retaliation. One man's courage saved the world, and for decades, nobody even knew his name. Meanwhile, above Cuba, another crisis was unfolding. On October 27th, a day that would be called Black Saturday, a US U-2 spy plane was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed. This was a massive escalation. The military chiefs in the Pentagon were unanimous. They urged Kennedy to retaliate immediately with an airstrike. The pressure on the young president was immense. War seemed inevitable. As tensions reached their absolute peak, a bizarre and secret back-channel communication opened. A KGB agent and an ABC News reporter met in a Washington, D.C. coffee shop. This unofficial line of communication allowed for ideas to be floated without the formal pressure of diplomacy. Through this channel, and through a series of increasingly frantic letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, a deal began to take shape. Khrushchev was looking for a way out that didn't look like a complete surrender. He sent 2 letters to Kennedy. The first was emotional, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. But the second letter, which arrived hours later, was much harsher, adding a new demand: the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The advisors in ExComm were confused. Which letter should they respond to? In a stroke of genius, Bobby Kennedy suggested they simply ignore the second, more aggressive letter and publicly accept the terms of the first one. It was a brilliant diplomatic gamble, but there was another, secret component to the deal. In a private meeting with the Soviet ambassador, Robert Kennedy gave a verbal promise. He confirmed that the U.S. did indeed plan to remove its missiles from Turkey, but it had to be done quietly, months later, so it wouldn't look like a trade. The U.S. couldn't appear to be horse-trading its allies' security. On the morning of October 28th, Radio Moscow announced that the Soviet Union had agreed to dismantle the missile sites. The crisis was over. A collective sigh of relief was heard around the globe. The Soviet ships turned back, the U.S. lifted its quarantine, and the world, which had teetered on the brink of annihilation, stepped back. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a profound lesson in leadership, brinksmanship, and the terrifying logic of nuclear deterrence. It showed how easily miscalculation, fear, and faulty communication could lead to global catastrophe. It also showed that even in the darkest of times, diplomacy and a desperate desire for survival can prevail. The events of those 13 days in October 1962 are not just a chapter in a history book. They are a stark, terrifying reminder of how fragile our world is, and how close we once came to losing it all. It's a story we should never, ever forget. Thanks for watching.